understand the mystery. First take a look at the history. The words we use will give us clues. So join us now in Church Chatter. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics.
And I'm Dillon. I have my MDiv, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
This is episode 15, and this episode is all about the sign of the cross, which I have a lot to say about the sign of the cross. I know Dillon has a lot too.
As do I.
So I want to start by saying that this episode is because we're talking about the sign of the cross has a lot to do with the cross. It has a lot to do with theology, with Trinity and theology, of course. And then we'll get into the sign of the cross. Since we are going to be talking about the cross, I want to start out by saying that this episode is going to discuss some violence and brutality connected to Jesus dying on the cross. We're going to be quite direct in how that happens. So if you're around young children, I just wanted to let you know that it might get a little, what's the word I'm looking for? Gruesome, maybe?
Could get a little graphic.
Graphic, that's the word I was looking for, graphic. So handle with care.
And real quick, also the sign of the cross, which obviously we'll be talking about, has to do with not just the words we say in our daily lives or in worship, but it has to do with the cross connects us with the spiritual practice of embodiment.
Oh, I'm going to be talking about that. Don't you worry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's start by saying this. As you already know, if you've been listening to this podcast, Dillon is a pastor. I study religious linguistics. Linguistics is a fancy way to say language and culture, right? So I study the intersections between religious language and culture. And I know that we often think of language as something that can be spoken with our mouths or written down using a set of symbols that we call the alphabet. But language is actually much more broad than this. It's not just words that we say or words that we write down. Language is anything that communicates, which can mean a lot of things, right? So for example, sign language is a language that is studied in linguistics. Body language, which cannot be written down or spoken out loud, is a form of communication and language that is studied within the field of linguistics. The study of rhetoric, which is within linguistics, is a way to look at language through settings and tone and figures of speech and all of this kind of stuff, right? So I just want to start by breaking the definition of language wide open. A part of linguistics that I'm really interested in is the study of symbols, especially Christian symbols, and there are so many. So let's break down what a symbol is before we start talking about the cross and the Trinity and the sign of the cross. So, well, let's actually say this really quick. When we say the sign of the cross, the whole episode is leading to what does the sign of the cross mean, which is whenever you touch your forehead, touch your heart or your chest, touch one shoulder and touch the other shoulder. Mm-hmm. I go left shoulder then right shoulder. Is that what you do?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
So
we can talk about that more at the end, I think.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it because depending on if you're a Christian in the Western tradition, which is Protestantism or Roman Catholicism, you would go to the West, right?
Right.
Your form of the sign of the cross would go to the West. Correct.
Like the left. Mm-hmm. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
And then if you are an Eastern Orthodox Christian or an Eastern Catholic Christian, the sign of the cross goes from the east, in which you would start from the right.
Right. And we're going to talk about that kind of split between the east and the west towards the end too. But that's what we mean when we say the sign of the cross. So let's talk about symbols so we can talk about what the cross meant and means. We tend to take things as literal, right? But actually a lot of communication is symbolic. Language itself is a symbol. A symbol is anything that we give meaning to. So the written alphabet, it's just a set of lines and shapes that we have all assigned meaning. Letters, like the letter A, is a symbol. It doesn't actually have a literal understanding. We as humans give it meaning, which makes it symbolic. We have even assigned specific sounds to these symbols that we call letters. And these sounds strung together are words. And words are symbols that we have assigned meaning to, right? So I know that gets kind of philosophical, but it's actually very simple. So CAT spells cat. That word is not itself a cat. It's a symbol pointing to a cat. Symbols point to something bigger. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
So we assign words to things and concepts so that we can communicate about them, right? Stop signs, traffic lights, these are symbols that we create and bring into our awareness so we can all as humans have a shared experience. Because there is something visceral and physical and grounded and earthy about being a human. To feel real together, we need symbols. We need to bring symbols really are a way to bring unseen things like our beliefs and our worldviews and our emotions and our feelings and our sensations and what we smell and what we see. All of these things are unseen, right? Symbols are a way to bring these things into our shared spaces so that we aren't isolated to experiencing this insane thing that we call reality or life. Symbols are a way to bring our internal lives out into shared spaces in a physical way so we can share it together, right? That's what language is. It's a symbol so that we can all communicate what's happening on the inside, what we're witnessing. Am I
Yeah, that's great.
going too woo-woo? Does that make sense to you?
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. So there's something deeply human about not doing humanity alone, and symbols are a huge part of that. If you go to church, especially a liturgical church or like a mainline Protestant church, a Catholic church, an Orthodox church, an entire worship service is just about all symbols, right? It's about bringing symbols into our shared spaces so we can bring our internal worlds and parts of the Christian story into the experienceable outside reality that we can all bear witness to together in real time. So we have a baptismal font full of water. That's a symbol, right? We have candles. Those are symbols. They're pointing to parts of the story. We have music. That's a symbol, right? If you go to a liturgical church, there are parts of the annual season of the liturgical season where the music is more serious. Sometimes it's more like celebration kind of music and joyful, right? The music is a symbol to set the tone for what the story and the emotions are during that time. These are all symbols that bring the Christian story that we are all living out in our own ways, if you are Christian, into the shared space between us so that we can do it together. So before we talk about the sign of the cross, we need to understand both the cross and the doctrine of the Trinity as symbols that point to something else. Anything to add there?
I would just say, as we flow into talking about the church's teaching on the Trinity, or as that you like to use that fancy word, the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is deeply important to those in both the Western and Eastern Christian churches. And as a Lutheran pastor, I uphold the doctrine of the Trinity. And it's very much a part of Lutheran theology. But interestingly enough, you can, a lot of people over the years have said, oh, God, the Trinity is just so hard to understand, and I don't really even believe it, and it's just weird, and I could really have Christianity without it. And actually, the doctrine of the Trinity, especially if you are embodying the practice of understanding how the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, whatever language you want to use for the Trinity, how those three are one and yet separate, and how they work together. One of the great ways to help embody that reality of the Trinity in our lives is to make the sign of the cross,
right?
Which flows out of the waters of baptism.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about Trinity in a couple minutes. First, I want to talk about the cross, because I think that then kind of leads into the Trinity and then the sign of the cross.
Right. But I just think, like, some people think about the Trinity and they think it's an abstract teaching,
right? And
making the sign of the cross and connecting that to the reality of the living Trinity in one's life can actually be a practice of spiritual embodiment that can help you understand not just the Trinity itself, but how God, the one and three and the three and one, are working in your life. I know that might sound a little technical.
No, it doesn't. That's what I was kind of trying to get at in the introduction too, just talking about symbols. And so really all I was trying to say with all of that is, As humans, we have these unseen parts of our lives, right? Like when I feel sad on a random Tuesday morning, I can tell Dillon with words, which are just symbols, right? Like, I mean, we live together, we're married, so I'm not writing him letters, but like I could write him a letter.
Well, that would be nice, though. That could be a nice new practice.
I could write him a letter, which becomes a physical thing in the real world, explaining my sadness, so then I'm not alone in it, because there's something deeply human about not being alone, but so much of our life is unseen. That's what symbols are, right? Many people have been transformed and made new by the Christian story. Baptism is a symbolic gesture in a lot of ways. I know that we could really debate that, but it's a symbolic gesture involving water and oil and fire to symbolize this new life. So whenever we go to church on Sunday morning, we see a baptismal font so that everybody there can be reminded that we were made new by this story. We were transformed in some way. Theologian, pastor, do you want to rebuttal that at all?
No, I think one of the dangers of reducing the sacraments, which for most Protestants is baptism and communion. For Roman Catholics, they have the 7 sacraments. But I'm not a Roman Catholic priest. I'm a Protestant Lutheran pastor, and so the sacraments for us, for Protestants, are baptism and communion. And sometimes, especially Protestant traditions, we have reduced the sacraments to just special words of blessing. It's the words that we say that make the things. And actually, that's not the fullness of the definition of what a sacrament is.
It incorporates earthly elements.
It incorporates earthly elements. You cannot have a sacrament with just the words. Mm-hmm. If I were to just say, you are baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen, and not use water, that's not a baptism. Mm-hmm. It is oil, fire, the giving of a candle, the anointing of oil on the forehead with the sign of the cross, which we'll talk about. Mm-hmm. It is the earthly element. It's the bread and wine that come with the words of God in the Eucharist, in communion. So the sacraments and the sign of the cross, these gestures, are not only symbols, but they're the reality of what God has given us to make something ordinary now something unique, extraordinary.
And even more than that, it also points to, I mean, the Bible says this over and over again, the renewal of all things, right? Our English language, we say like, oh, humans go out into nature. Like, oh, as a human, I love to go out into nature. And sometimes I even say that because that's how our language is set up. That's false. We are nature. We are not separate from nature. We are a part of nature. We're not even at the top of nature. We are so fully consumed by it, and it consumes that, like, it's just...
I don't want to get in the weeds with this, but it is, when you think of like water, or you think of, like maybe a stream or a pond, or maybe you think of trees or flowers or dirt or whatever it is, even our human bodies, all these things. It's interesting, Jesus has that passage in the Gospels in which he says, consider the lilies of the field, how they toil and snare, for they are even greater than the great buildings of Solomon and all of Solomon's wisdom. This idea of the natural world and to the things that God has created, including humanity, you might think it's weird. Jesus is telling you to look to the flowers, and from those flowers you'll see the goodness of God and the wisdom of God, the Spirit of God. And so when we use things that come from nature, including ourselves by our own hands and fingers making the sign of the cross, things that point us back to God, you start to see these things. The flowers, dust to dust. I mean, if you go to a liturgical church with the first Sunday, or the first day of Lent is Ash Wednesday, also you go and you get ashes in the sign of what? The cross on your forehead. So there's all these earthly elements that it's not just words, it's actions.
Yes, and the sign of the cross is you might wonder, like, why are they talking about all of this whenever this is about the sign of the cross? Because the sign of the cross is a way to embody the story. So we're not just sitting there hearing words and hearing parts of the Bible read to us and thinking about it. And just like humans are part of creation, it's not like there's nature in us. We are nature, where it's all symbiotic. Is that the word I'm looking for?
Yeah,
it's all
not anthropocentric, which means
right.
not
People are not
human-centered.
at the center of it, right? It's all mushed together. We're all part of this great system called creation that just keeps expanding together. And when we go to church and a worship service, and really just every part of our life, it's not just about our intellect. In fact, I mean, I think anybody who lives a kind of spiritual life at this point, or like leans that way, has heard this, but the mind is a great servant, but doesn't make a great master, right? Like, the intellect does not rule. The body knows things that the brain does not. In fact, the brain often works against what the body knows. Creation knows things that our intellect cannot, right? There's other ways of knowing that go beyond our brain and reason and logic and intellect. And doing the sign of the cross is one small way, in conjunction with everything else, to be embodied and to be part of creation in our body. So,
and also pointing us back to a very act itself, which is every time you make the sign of the cross, and we'll talk about this, but every time you make the sign of the cross, you're actually not only pointing back
to the story,
to God's self, but you're pointing back to a more ancient story, and you're connecting to your baptism, which included water and oil and light and all these things.
Right.
Even the clothing, giving a new garment, that's part of a lot of ceremonies. Yeah.
So this is our 15th episode, so we've been doing this for 15 weeks. So is that like 3 months or something?
That's a long time, and I'm loving it.
We're going to keep doing it, but if you listen to every episode, you're probably starting to see that all of these things are intertwined, right? All of these things touch on each other. Okay, so let's talk about the cross. I got excited and I started to talk fast, and I'm really trying to be intentional about talking slow. Okay, the cross. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds or the details of this, because many of these stories aren't even mine to tell, but I do just want to kind of set the scene of the cross by saying that I have a lot of people close to me who have experienced and are experiencing imprisonment, right? In my childhood, I spent many Saturday afternoons sitting in a prison visiting room playing board games. I have visited multiple people who I love very much in prisons. I have picked someone up on the day they were released. I couldn't tell you how many hours and days in courtrooms and with public defenders trying to help some people close to me understand the very complicated legal system. I've seen people who struggle with addiction get themselves clean and then really begin to kind of heal and turn their life around and turn in a new direction, only for the legal system to catch up with them a couple years later and sentence them, and then they have to do many, many months in jail after they were like on this different path, right? So all of this is to say that I have a deep concern, for lack of a better word, for our systems of rehabilitation, which are less about rehabilitation and more about punishment often. And this is a way to kind of open up the conversation about the cross, because that's what it is. The cross was a form of legal punishment and even warning for others. So to really ground this, because I don't like just talking about how Jesus died on the cross 2,000 years ago. That has implications for today and how we treat people today. So obviously, Jesus died on the cross. More than that, he was murdered using the tool of the cross. So I actually tend to, when I write books about this stuff, I don't like to say that he died on the cross. I like to say that he was murdered on the cross, because he was. Just because it was a state-sanctioned murder or killing doesn't make it less of a murder. The Roman Empire, as a system, murdered Jesus. And we wear our little crosses on our jewelry, and we have crosses hanging on our house. And I say this with some snark, but listen, me too. I have a cross hanging right here at my desk next to me. I have a cross on a bracelet that I'm wearing right now, right? So I get it. But just to kind of put this into context, this is the equivalence to wearing an electric chair around our necks, right? Or like having paintings of the electric chair. So the cross has almost become, in some ways, I know that some people take it very seriously. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with wearing a cross necklace or something. There's nothing wrong with that. But just really think about how visceral the cross was. It was a weapon of murder, and it killed many thousands of people. Anything to add there?
Well, and this is not taking away the uniqueness of Jesus's crucifixion, in which the Christian tradition has a lot of understandings about why that happened, how that happened, yada yada. But crucifixion was not something just unique to Jesus.
Right.
I mean, I know most of our listeners, you probably know that, but a lot of times we think about crucifixion and we think of Jesus. And yes, that obviously there is a uniqueness about the cross and its connection to Jesus. I don't doubt that as a Christian. I don't doubt that as a pastor. And yet, crucifixion at the time of Jesus, and even before and even after, was a tool of state-sanctioned murder.
Yes. Just like the electric chair, just like lethal injections,
yes.
right? Today. So just...
It was state-sanctioned capital punishment.
Yes. Death penalty.
The death penalty.
Right. And I also want... I'll say it in a couple minutes. I want to say that... I'm going to say it now. Jesus was guilty. Jesus was guilty of what they murdered him for. They killed him for treason, and he was, in fact, treacherous. He did not outright deny being king of the Jews. And to call yourself a king in the Roman emperor was an act of crime. He was, like, if you're talking about the letter of the law, he was guilty of a crime in the Roman Empire. So let's just put a pin in that, and I'll come back to it. So I think that's important.
And also true with that, you could go with the guilty verdict. With that does hold up and work
from the lens of Roman emperors.
And you can also go from what many of the scriptures say, and some even allude to, that Jesus knew what he was doing. He knew that what he was doing, he went to the cross willingly because he was standing for a cause. He was standing for reform. Mm-hmm. He was standing for bringing justice and mercy and love and forgiveness. He was God. For Christians, the doctrine of the incarnation. He was God in human form. He was showing the way to God, and that way was not the way of Rome and the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. And so he went willingly to die, and yet at the same time, simultaneously, was murdered by the state. Both of those things can be true. Both of those things are true.
It is true. So I didn't plan on saying this, but it's coming up for me, so I am going to say it. And some people aren't going to like it. And just to be clear, I'm not calling Jesus a gang leader. That is not what I'm about to say. But there's a book called Gang Leader for a Day that a sociologist wrote many years ago, and it's one of the best books I've ever read. Essentially, the sociologist had an in with a gang leader in Center City somewhere. Chicago? I can't even remember now where it was. But he found that gangs are often like an alternative law enforcement in communities where law enforcement isn't doing their job well. Like, they're not supporting the people of that community well, for a lot of reasons baked into racist political systems, right? Systematic racism, all of those things. So I'm saying that because there's a lot of people who commit crimes, and some of them find themselves on death row in our country, and they are convinced that they were doing what was right. And through a certain lens, maybe even they were. I'm not advocating for gang leaders and gangs. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying it's more complicated than, oh, these people are just committing crimes. Some crimes are just outright, I don't know if I want to say bad people. I can get really theological fast. But I just think there's a lot of ways to look at it. Jesus, for sure, in some ways was innocent. In other ways, in a way that the Roman Empire saw it, he was guilty. Just like some people today, yeah, they're guilty according to the law, but there's some real moral things mixed up in there that we need to address. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. So really what I wanted to do is put it into context. Whenever you see somebody wearing a cross around their neck, or maybe some artwork with a cross on it, to really kind of make it more, I love the word visceral right now, make it more visceral and kind of concrete for you to carry the weight of it. This is what I often do. It's the equivalent of a painting of a lynching tree, right? Or someone hanging from a tree. It's the equivalent of a lethal injection or an electric chair, right? We still have crucifixion. It just looks different now, right? It's just different now. You could say better. You could say more humane. I'm not sure. It's still killing.
The cross. Can I bring this up? So there's this very, very old and ancient practice in the Christian church, particularly in the Western Christian churches. So again, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, mostly in Lutheran and Episcopal churches. Some churches still do this today, and some have lost the practice, and yet the practice still lives on in many different ways. The church that I serve, we practice this. So if there is a cross, if there is a symbol of an actual cross in your worship space, during the season of Lent, beginning on the first day of Lent on Ash Wednesday, in which we literally get the sign of the cross made with ashes on our forehead, beginning on that day all the way up to Easter, all the crosses in the worship space are veiled in black shrouds or black cloth, and they're covered over during Lent. And this shows that the powers of the world, the darkness of the world, the darkness of empire, the darkness of our own brokenness, the things that draw us away from God, during Lent, we reflect on those things so that when we get to Easter, that is all ripped off and ripped away. So there's this idea that the cross actually, that Jesus, who died on the cross, literally takes all the gook of the systematic evils of the world, the individual evils in our own ways that draw us away from God, and putting the black cloth over the crosses reminds us that throughout Lent, all of that stuff is taken from us by the cross, and when Easter comes, that is ripped off and a white cloth is put on. And this whole idea of symbolism that that the cross calls us to a new way, including making the sign of a cross, and we really try to embody that in our life. And so some of those liturgical practices of having the crosses shrouded in black during Lent and ripped off on Easter with white also reminds us of embodiment practices. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. Well, it's a good segue into saying that the image of the cross is all about power. Jesus was killed by the Romans, and they were known to crucify dogs, which says a lot about what they thought about those they were crucifying, right?
Yeah.
Crucifixion was for those at the very bottom of the Roman social hierarchy. So bandits, enslaved people, traitors. Jesus, of course, was labeled as a traitor and treacherous. A little language history for you. The word crucifixion is connected to the word excruciating, which makes perfect sense, right? And crucifixion was a symbolic form of punishment because these public murders, they were on display for everybody to see, and it served as a warning for what happened to your body if you did not walk a straight path in the Roman system. Your body was straightened for you. So those with power forced bodies, like the body of Jesus of Nazareth, into a straight line on the cross using nails going through bones, nailing a body to the wood of the cross, right? Like, just think about it. Like, that is excruciating. They remained on this cross until their last breath. And this was a punishment for the individual for breaking the rules, for sure, but it was also a warning because everybody could see this, right? It was on public display. It was a warning.
A legal deterrent.
Yes. So it was a warning for anybody considering straying from this straight path created by the Roman Empire. So it wasn't just like, oh, let's hang them on this cross. It was, number one, crosses can be seen on hills from far distances. Number two, it was, again, this symbolic thing. And I mean, power, people in power love symbols. They really do. Look around, they're everywhere. That's what flags are, right? So the Roman Empire loved this symbol of like, oh, you're not going to walk the straight path. I'll make you straight till your last breath. So it was like this way of physically making them straight so people could see what happened to them if they stepped out of the straight path. So in a kind of lesser way, this does make me think about kind of like the power of cops who pull people over for speeding. This serves not just as a way to find somebody and punish them for speeding on the highway, but also to warn those of us driving past, oh, I better slow down, right? Like, it's that same concept. Law enforcement is often a public thing because, listen, we have the technology now for sure, especially where when someone's speeding, and some places do this with cameras. They still do. Pennsylvania doesn't. We don't have cameras, but they could just take a picture of our license plate and just send us this, right? But some states still see the power and like, well, no, because it actually deters it. It's a warning, and it deters everybody else from breaking the speed limit. This is obviously not getting pulled over and getting a fine is not the same as hanging on a cross, but it's the same idea where it serves as a warning for everybody else and a punishment for the person. Anything to add? You look pensive about that.
Well, yeah. No, I'm not going to add no.
Okay. So in the first century, following the murder of Jesus on the cross was not embraced, right? Jesus' followers thought the cross as an image was cruel and even distasteful. So what's really interesting is that non-Jesus followers, so many Romans, actually had images of the cross on their household items like bowls or lamps to remind their enslaved people what would happen if they disobeyed, right? So the cross was kind of like a decoration, almost like it is now, just casually on a plate or a bowl or a lamp, a cross just hanging on the wall to remind enslaved people in your household what would happen if they disobeyed.
And you can see
not pointing to Jesus yet.
And you can see this in ancient pottery.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I wrote this down because I wanted to remind myself to say but I might have passed this in my notes already, but years ago they found an archaeological dig found a male's foot bone with a with a large nail going through the heel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Evidence of crucifixion, right? And that is on display, I think, in Jerusalem at a museum.
I forget,
like
but it's
Israel.
a well-known,
And I've seen pictures of this, and at the end I'll recommend a book which has a picture of this, and it's a gruesome thing to see. It's not a small nail. It's like a thick nail. Ugh, yeah. It's crazy. So when Jesus told his disciples to take up their cross and follow him, right? Like we have this phrase today, people say like, oh, it's just my cross to bear. When Jesus told his disciples to take up their cross and follow to him, he was not talking metaphorically. This was not a symbol. He was literally telling them to be so committed. So again, let's remember, we talked about this, I think last episode or a few episodes ago. We talked about this on many episodes, actually. Jesus was born into the promised land at a time when the Romans had taken it over. And the promised land was supposed to be the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, right? It's often called that, which was they were going to arrange their lives based on what we now have recorded in the Torah, right? Based on the Ten Commandments and Sabbath, the practice of Sabbath, and the rules outlined in Leviticus about how you apologize and how you take ownership for your wrongdoings and how you give sacrifices as part of that process, right? All of this. Worship rules and all these hierarchies, right? They were spelled out in Leviticus. How you feed the poor, how you save part of your crops for the poor, how you weren't allowed to charge interest, right? They had all these rules that we can find in the Bible today. They were arranging their lives that way. And then before Jesus was born, the Roman Empire came in, conquered, and they occupied this land. And then Jesus was born, and him, along with his entire community of Jewish people, they were upset about it. So his entire set of teachings should be viewed through this lens where Jesus was trying to get back to this Jewish way, or at least a way not occupied by the corrupt Roman way, where there was violence and not taking care of the poor, and people were starving and dying and becoming enslaved, right?
Yeah, and we have to be we have to be very sensitive, and I'm going to give a disclaimer with this. I do not want my statement to be anti-Semitic.
No.
In that anti-Semitic meaning anti-Jewish, and yet during Jesus's time was known as the time of Second Temple Judaism.
Right.
It was a specific time during which there was the Second Temple, and there was specific practices that went with Second Temple Judaism. And unfortunately, during that time of Jesus, when Jesus came, Second Temple Judaism, not in all ways, but in some ways, was as we would say metaphorically, in bed with Rome. In that there was a lot of corruption going on, not just with Roman government and the empire and the emperor, but also these things that trickled in or trickled down to Jewish life and practice, including in the temple in Jerusalem. There was a lot of unsavory practices going on, actually to which Jesus was calling out for reform in his own tradition.
Yes.
Not leaving Judaism by any means, and yet at the same time calling for people to be against the evils of Rome, and also to reform the beauty of the Jewish tradition, seeing it as being, at his time, kind of infiltrated by a lot of corrupt practices, both in the high priesthood of the Jewish high priests, and yet also this kind of puppet control of Rome. So there kind of was a both and here.
It's not unlike the evangelical takeover of the United States government right now. Dillon's cringing when I say it, but I'm going to be bold and say it. It's not unlike what's happening right now in the United States. Evangelicals, and a small sect of them, right, a specific version of evangelicalism, they have been working for decades. This is not just like, oh, this happened. They have been working for decades to gain power and riches, and there are megachurch pastors who have personal helicopters and don't even write their own sermons. They pay somebody to write their sermons, right? There's corruption within Christianity. So this isn't just us saying, oh, there were some Jews who were corrupt at the time. There's Christians right now who are corrupt in the same exact way. We're holding hands with power in a way that we want power for ourselves. And that's the very thing Jesus was teaching against.
And a couple things here. I agree that the kind of modern day American megachurch evangelical movement, there is deep un-Christ-like practices within that movement. And yet, I want to go on the record here, for at least myself, but for the both of us perhaps, and say that there are well-meaning, well-intentioned, Christ-centered, Christ-focused evangelicals in this country and in churches sitting in chairs and pews that are practicing an evangelical theology and are not part of this bigger thing. There's many evangelical, and there's also many mainline, more inclusive or progressive or liberal minded Christians or Protestants like myself who also in those denominations have issues and concerns too. So it's all throughout, and yet I concur with what
I definitely don't want to generalize and say evangelicalism. I'm saying there's a sect of evangelical megachurch kind of vibes that, I don't even know if I want to say vibes, but just people who have been planning takeovers of school boards and takeovers of government positions, and we're starting, I hate the word manifest, but that's what's coming up for me. It's starting to manifest now. We're starting to see those effects of all this planning. It's happening. And it's because they want power and control for themselves, which is what Jewish people who were struggling wanted.
Well, they want a theocracy, which means that they want their own theology and their own religion to govern that of every single person, which is actually, if you're living in the United States, we're speaking as followers of Jesus Christ, as baptized Christians, and yet the whole idea of the American experiment is that, yes, you can have an integrated life in terms of living in society and also being a member of a church, and yet at the same time, the whole concept of the American experience, especially the Constitution, is that we not only have the freedom to either believe or not believe, but the government does not have a specific religion. And so when you get weird like that, the government is to protect all religions and people who are not affiliated with any type of religion. That's that. If we're talking about the American way, that is the American way. The American way is not a theocracy.
I also think it's beautiful if you are a Christian and you are politically minded and you feel a push to be working in politics. I think that it's beautiful if you bring your Christian values into that somewhat.
I think you should.
There's a way to do that. There's a separation of church and state. There's a way to do that. And if you're going to do that, can we please stop obsessing over who uses what bathroom and instead start focusing on the fact that the Bible does say, if we're going to be biblical about it, it says things like you have to save the corner of your farm for the widows and the foreigners among us, right? The Bible has a lot to say about welcoming the foreigner. The Bible has a lot to say about feeding the hungry and clothing the poor, right?
And
why can't we lift those
and the
things
orphan,
up? Yeah,
and taking care
it
of
has
the
a lot to
environment.
say about including the outsider over and over and over again. So can we focus on those things that actually kind of empower and uplift? Anyway, let's get back to the cross, which this is all related to the cross, right? So when Jesus told his disciples to take up their cross and follow him, he was not being metaphorical. He was literally telling them to be so committed to the Jewish cause of bringing God's way to earth, which is often called the kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven, in the promised land, that they were willing to be killed for their cause. That's what he was saying. And of course, him and some others were. I also want to make it clear that the Roman Empire is who took away the Jewish hope for the kingdom coming to earth in the promised land. So Jesus was very much aligned against the Roman Empire. In fact, I have read extensively about the fact that Gospels were not written down until after the temple was destroyed. And people, Jews were paraded naked in the streets and then killed or enslaved in Roman households after that. They were afraid of the Romans. So when these Gospels were written down, we actually get a very watered down version of how anti-Rome he actually was, because people were afraid to write it down very directly, which I just find that really compelling. So, and he's already pretty anti-Rome in what we have, but that it could have been much more direct, but they were afraid after the fall of the temple.
And a lot of people don't like to talk about this, and I'm not talking about every Christian should walk around with this idea of persecution. I actually think there's a deep disconnect between actual persecution and people claiming persecution.
We're going to do an episode on the word martyr soon.
However, martyr, being a martyr, or martyrdom, meaning this idea of many martyrs, that is a fact. From the very beginning of Christianity, the idea of martyrdom has always been there, including Jesus being the first martyr himself for the cause to make things. So the idea that one is a martyr or a part of martyrdom and persecution.
Some people say that the kids who were killed by Herod were the first martyrs. Not Jesus.
Yes, but I'm talking about the actual formal movement.
Okay.
So there's.
We could also maybe.
Well, there's multiple interpretations, and
I think John the Baptist could be seen as a martyr for that movement as well. He was killed first.
Yes, but I'm talking about what the one in whom people aren't following John. People aren't following, at least today. People aren't following John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a part of the martyrdom.
So you're picturing the Jesus movement starting with Jesus.
I'm not saying it started with Jesus. I'm saying what it has evolved into is Jesus as the pioneer and the many people that surround him. John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, his mother Mary, the Holy Innocents, the babies.
Every Jewish person in Israel came before him.
So I'm not.
Right.
I'm saying that he is, as the book of Hebrews would say, the pioneer and perfecter of the faith.
Sure.
He's kind of the central one. That doesn't. I shouldn't have said first. Central, yes. First, no.
The reason I'm being nitpicky about it is because it's so important to me. Christianity, I used to think it's like, oh, this thing that Jesus was a part of it, and then I pictured Jesus as point zero. Ground zero.
Well, no, that's not true. Yes, correct.
And it made no sense to me that way. And ever since I realized, Jesus is a Jew, and he comes from a long line of Jews, it broke the whole thing open for me. He's the one for us Christians, right? Like he's the one, but there would be no Jesus without a rich ancestry and history that came before him. So I
was just going to say our ancient Jewish ancestors matter.
Yes. There would be no Jesus if it wasn't for the Israelites, like the whole Jewish story that came before Jesus. There would be no Jesus.
This is a slide.
It wouldn't make sense.
We should probably move on, but I do want to say this that actually upsets me sometimes when and I don't mean to pick on them, but I just said this a couple weeks ago. There's something called the Gideon movement, and the Gideon movement is
if you've been to a hotel, you've seen a Gideon Bible.
Gideons were the ones that helped get Bibles in hotel rooms, and yet what they did was they removed the Hebrew scriptures, they removed the Old Testament, they removed all of our Jewish ancestors, and once you do that, one could really start to question whether you have the fullness of the whole story. You cannot remove the life of Jesus from his very people.
You cannot remove Judaism from him.
You can't do that. Christianity wouldn't make sense if you didn't have the Jewish ancestors. Okay,
It also would not make sense if you took away the Roman Empire.
Correct.
So what's fun about this podcast, a little side note, is that this is how Dillon and I talk just in general. We just happen to be recording right now.
Are you exhausted by thinking about this?
And sometimes I feel like, we're on a lot of side tangents, but I think that's part of it. Side tangents are just part of it. Well, everything belongs.
Well, the cross is a side tangent, and I'll tell you why. Because people like to think about the cross and how the cross connects them to God through Jesus, and yet the cross is both horizontal and vertical. Mm-hmm. And the cross, as Jesus was reaching out his arms, was on many bunny trails, was opening up many different branches to talk about many different things, all of which flow to the cross. So
right, the cross is about our relationship to God, but also to each other.
But to each other, God's
vertical
the body of Christ. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jesus was very much aligned against the Roman Empire, and he was not quiet about that. And by the time this is interesting to me. By the time the Gospels were being written down, which was decades after Jesus died, the cross was a symbol for what sometimes was called the way, which meant the path to dying to one life to live another. This was called the way. So during Jesus's life, this was a literal dying on the cross to show how committed they were to the cause against the Roman way of arranging society, against Roman violence, against Roman occupation, against the Romans taking Jews as slaves, against the Romans not feeding people, coming in, occupying their land, taking their land from them, taking their jobs from them, controlling parts of their lives. Jesus was against that. And to be part of this movement called the way, right? We still see that language, right? Like, I am the way, the life, right? The way was seen as, it was very connected to dying to one way of life to have another way of life. Today, we kind of have that in baptism, right? Like, we're dying to one way of life to be committed to another way. So by the time the Gospels were written, there was some kind of distance from this cruel reality of dying on the cross to prove, not even to prove, but just to not be afraid to call out what is right, even if it means you're going to die an excruciating death. That's what the way was. Of course, now, many of us, parts of the world this is not true, but for many of us listening to this podcast, for Dillon and I, we aren't in immediate threat of that kind of thing. So it has kind of become, to die to one way of life has become more metaphorical, right? To take up your cross has become metaphorical, the way we see it in our culture today. But when we see in the Bible Jesus saying these things, it was very literal and very dangerous. I also want to say that, of course, crucifixion does predate the Roman Empire, but the Romans adopted it and used it as their own, as a method to kill many, many thousands of people. We talked about the skeleton. It was a first century man. Here are my notes. It was a first century man found north of Jerusalem. And it's going through his right heel. And crazy. So I do want to tell this quick story. Dillon already knows this story, but we were in Atlantic City, New Jersey a couple years ago, and if you've ever been there, there's a casino called Caesars. So now remember Pontius Pilate, he's known for ordering the killing of Jesus, and he was the emperor of Judea, and he served under Emperor Tiberius. Did I say that wrong?
He was the governor.
Thank you.
not the
Did
emperor.
I say emperor?
Yeah.
Emperor Tiberius. He was the governor of Judea. He served under the Emperor Tiberius.
Yeah,
Am I saying?
Pilate
was the governor. He served under the Emperor Tiberius.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay,
Good,
thank you.
Good.
And Tiberius was the stepson of Caesar Augustus, right? So to have this casino called Caesar's, it's a very Roman Empire kind of place. And if you've been there before in Atlantic City, New Jersey, the casino, and I think it's a hotel, right?
Yeah, they have great statues.
They do. That's what I was just going to say.
They have great statues and fountains. If you like that sort of a thing, you
Yeah.
know, that ancient Greco-Roman stuff, it's quite
and
quite
I'm not
elaborate.
against this. I'm about to sound all high and mighty. I'm not against it. It's what it, but they have these very big statues that glorify violence, right? It's these Roman emperors on horses conquering people, and horses have, I mean, we can get into all the symbols whenever a horse in ancient statue making and ancient art, if a horse was conquering a woman, that was another way to say nation, because of course in a patriarchy we like to conquer both our earth and our women. So that's a whole other thing that we could go down, but there's all these symbols, and the Caesar Hotel and Casino has all these statues of Roman emperors and horses and war and all this stuff.
And actually, when you enter Caesar's, I believe it's on the outside in Atlantic City, New Jersey. There is in the kind of the main entrance there. It is Caesar on a chariot with
Yes.
horses, showing that he is literally going to run over anything that is in his way.
And a chariot, we like to think of like England and, oh, we're going to go through New York City in a chariot. No, a chariot was a weapon of war back then. A chariot was a symbol of, not even a symbol, it was a literal weapon of war. Chariots were used.
It was
horses and chariots were weapons of war.
Yeah, and it
Right.
was this idea of like literally steamrolling anyone that's in your way.
Yeah, so there's all these symbols at this casino in Atlantic City, New Jersey, of horses and chariots and war heroes, and they're triumphant, right? So we're there. I think this is before we had kids. I can't remember. No, maybe we had them. I can't remember.
I think it was before.
Okay, so we're walking around, and there's all these statues, and we're looking at them, and then I look over and I see this woman with this big cross necklace. And there's just something about the like juxtaposition of that moment for me. And obviously there's nothing wrong with her wearing a cross necklace in Caesar's. It's totally fine. But it's just that moment of like 2,000 years after Jesus has died by the Roman Empire, I'm in this casino in Atlantic City, New Jersey, with all this glorification of the Roman Empire. And then there's this woman next to me wearing this big cross. And like, do you know what I mean?
Oh,
that
yeah.
moment was, I'll never forget it. It was just like a
interesting.
weird, like, oh, Christianity actually has lost touch with how important the Roman Empire is to the Jesus story.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Okay.
I'm just thinking about such the delicious food that they have there. But anyways.
So the cross was violent. All of that is to say the cross was violent. So let's put a pin in this about the cross, right? Because in a couple minutes we're going to talk about the sign of the cross. But let's talk about the Trinity, because it's called the sign of the cross, but it's really very much about the Trinity, the sign of the cross.
Oh, that's...
And
Yeah.
a lot of early Christians and early Jesus followers believe that Jesus didn't become divine until resurrection. So the cross is very much, now I think that'd be considered heresy now.
It is heretical.
But,
For
a while...
Not technically. It is.
It
is.
But
heresy,
for a while, there was not a small sect that believed that.
No,
right?
correct.
And they used some of Paul's writings to kind of give them point to that.
Mm-hmm.
That's another time, another conversation, episode. But so the Trinity, the concept of the Trinity, is connected to the cross. So during the first century, there was no formal Christianity. That's why you hear Dillon and I say Jesus followers, right? Like communities of Jesus followers or early Jesus followers. I do not say Christians, because the first century, 3 centuries, 2 centuries?
Yeah, well, at least 2 centuries.
Right.
Some would argue early third. But
Well, I'm going to talk about that.
they were definitely the idea of like the word Christian, or the concept of Christian, how we would think about it today, did not exist.
Yeah, the first few hundred years after Jesus died, especially the first century, there were a lot of Jesus communities, but they didn't agree with each other, right? That's why Paul was writing a lot of letters to a lot of different communities, trying to get them to agree and to get along, because there was not a unified way to understand what happened on the cross and who Jesus was. They just knew that it was something powerful, so they kept telling the story, but it was pretty messy. It wasn't unified.
They were deeply transformed. And and another important thing as we talk about the sign of the cross and the importance of the sign of the cross, also remember that in the very early days after Jesus' death and resurrection, especially in the first century and arguably the second century, you have two different types of Jesus followers. You have Jewish Jesus followers who are still who are still both ethnically and religiously Jewish, and yet embracing Jesus as the Anointed One, as the Messiah. And also, so you have that, and then you have people who Paul in particular had ministered to, who are more Hellenistic or Greek type Christians. They have a very different understanding of not only culture, but a very different understanding of the world and society, and yet they also were accepting Jesus as the Messiah and the Anointed One. And so you had two different cultures, and yet what connected them was the life and teachings of Jesus. So two different cultures, and yet Jesus was at the center of it. So you kind of had those things competing. They didn't all. So it wasn't all formulated. Does that make sense?
So there was no understanding of the Trinity yet. There was no understanding, really. I shouldn't say no understanding, but there wasn't a unified understanding.
Correct.
So let's just start by saying the Trinity is this church teaching defining God as three persons in one essence: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We'll get into that more then. But the Trinity as a concept, I'm going to really simplify this, but it began to come together. Even Christianity started to kind of take form and to be sort of fully realized under Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, who became a Jesus follower for one reason or another. It's actually still really debated whether he did this because he was transformed by the Jesus story or because it could help him maintain power if he joined forces with this growing number of Jesus followers. For whatever reason, he became Christian. Christianity didn't exist yet, but he was interested in the Jesus story, right? He wanted to align with it. So he wanted politics and Christianity to join forces. Empire and the cross started to hold hands, which is so interesting because the cross was actually trying to hold empire accountable. And then just a few hundred years after Jesus died, now they're holding hands. So I tend to be against that move, but I do want to acknowledge that perhaps if Constantine didn't do that, maybe Christianity wouldn't have survived as a movement.
Or it would have been a minority.
It would have been a minority.
Religion.
It would have been... and who's to say, I think that there's some beauty in a lack of uniformity and like house churches and communities, small communities that meet in homes getting together. There's beauty in that. I don't think that being in large numbers is necessarily something to strive towards all the time. I don't know. We could debate that, but nevertheless, Constantine wanted politics and Christianity to join forces, so that's what happened. So this can be seen as problematic. We could argue it. We'll never know how it would have played out with Constantine if we didn't have him, but the story as we have it, Constantine is part of the Christian story. We can't remove him. He wanted politics and Jesus followers to hold hands, but he quickly realized, actually there's no one understanding of who Jesus was and why he was important. So Constantine, I'm really simplifying, he essentially put a bunch of leaders in different Jesus communities together in a room and said, figure it out. Long story short, there was a group called the Council of Nicaea, and one of the things that they argued was Jesus's divine identity, and they created what is called the Nicene Creed to unify Christianity, which many of us still say today in its translated form during church services. And this was a step towards creating the official Trinitarian doctrine, the belief of the Trinity. And then in the year 381, the Council of Constantinople expanded the Nicene Creed and affirmed the divinity of the Holy Spirit. And then over time, a bunch of theologians like Augustine of Hippo, some fancy people helped form and refine this doctrine of the Trinity. And again, I'm really simplifying this.
This is impressive.
I'm leaving a lot out.
Yeah, this is good. This is good. Little systematic theology going
on.
Yeah,
this stuff is not usually my favorite. I think it's boring, but I still think it's important to talk about and name some of the...
I relish it.
I know you like it. You like it. It's important to know, and it's important to... I mean, there's a lot of groups that I could name here, but the Council of Nicaea, people have heard of because of the Nicene Creed. And honestly, the Council of Constantinople, I just like to say Constantinople. It reminds me of that song.
And I just want to make one mention that the doctrine of the Trinity as official church teaching came in the 4th century, specifically with the with the I want to say a word, but I don't know if it's right. It's good. Codification, which means
Codified, yeah.
Codified means official usage
Yeah.
in for the Nicene Creed, and the Nicene Creed. With all of its problems, is a very beautiful and wonderful gift to the church. That's my own opinion. But I think it's a very beautiful and wonderful thing and a gift to the church. And yet, we can still argue that with some of its problems. Yeah. Yet, even before the 4th century, especially in liturgical texts, in prayers, and the way people were worshiping and doing things, this idea that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, sometimes known as the Holy Ghost, were connected in some ways. That these were three different persons, or persons in Greeks means masks, and yet one in a kind of oneness.
So it's one essence with different masks.
Yes. But this was even before the 4th century. The 4th century codified it and made it official. But there were people talking about this even way before that. So it's not like, oh, all of a sudden we just came up with this. There was conversation around this.
Yes.
There was worship practice around that. It was just not an official
and we will eventually do a whole episode on Trinity. So I don't want to go too far into it because it gets pretty deep. But I do just want to say that if you don't understand the Trinity,
Sure, it's a mystery.
Yeah, that's kind of the point. I mean, one of the reasons many churches, Dillon and I included, are in this, we support baby baptism is because some people are like, oh, well, you need to understand. If I need to understand to be a part of this thing called Christianity, then there's no hope for any of us. I cannot, my whole life is about intellectual ladder climbing. My faith cannot be another expression of that. It can't be. It can't. I can't have to understand it to be a part of it, or I'll never be a part of it, right? So we're baptized in the name of the God, Father, the Holy Spirit. We're baptized in the Trinity, right? Great. I shouldn't have to understand it in order to be invited into it. That's the argument I have for baby baptism.
Right, and baptism is what God does for you, not what you have to do for God. Right. Once you have a theology of what you need to do for God, you become a part of works righteousness, and you're no longer, if you're a Protestant in particular, you're no longer believing in God's grace through faith in Jesus Christ. You're believing that you have to do works in order for God to love you. And so the idea that it's what God does in baptism, and it's what the Holy Spirit comes. It's not okay. Yes. We're getting into it.
So we're not going to get any further into the concept of the Trinity. Just to kind of set up what the Trinity was and how it came to be understood and realized. Let's talk about the sign of the cross. So early Christians would trace a small cross on their foreheads, which is still done Ash Wednesday. It's done at a lot of churches with ours included, our Lutheran church, with, I don't know, Dillon, what is it? Oil and dirt?
Ashes?
What do? You just take olive oil from your kitchen and go outside and get dirt and put it together. What do you do?
No, I guess you could do that, but that's no. The
do you
ash.
have to order it from a magazine?
You can order it from a magazine. You can do that now, especially in the modern days. We don't do that, but what ashes are on Ash Wednesday is so on Palm Sunday. Palms are blessed. They're blessed with oil and special words, special prayers, right? And so after those palms are blessed with water and prayers, they're given out to the faithful, and then some of them are kept. And the day before Ash Wednesday, which is known as Shrove Tuesday, you could do it beforehand. You don't have to do it on Shrove Tuesday. Those ashes are burned. Ashes are burned with olive oil and a little bit of water from the baptismal font, right? And so
can I pause you? Sure. Again, we're seeing this mixture of earthly elements, but we're also seeing baptism and the waters of baptism coming back, right? It's this baptismal font water. If you go to a Catholic church, and a Lutheran church that we used to go to did this, it depends on the culture of the church, but the baptismal font's kind of in that middle aisle, and as people come up for communion, they'll dip their fingers in and they'll do the sign of the cross, right? The sign of the cross is so rooted historically, traditionally, currently with baptism and the waters of baptism and oil and all these things that we're seeing, these symbols that we talked about, right?
And there's a beautiful thing with making the sign of the cross with ashes, specifically on Ash Wednesday, because all the things that make up the ashes on Ash Wednesday in the form of the cross points us back to the very Christian life and baptism. when one is baptized, it brings you into a life of growth. And so the palms, being that of something that grows like a plant, that is incorporated in the growth coming from baptism. So you have growth coming from the palms. You have this idea of burning or ash, reminding us of our mortality, that we're born and we die, and also the burning away of the things that draw us away from God, sin or brokenness or whatever it is. There is oil mixed in there because we know that God heals us, and water cleanses us and brings us to new life. All of those things have symbols in them that point on Ash Wednesday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the reason I brought up Ash Wednesday, even at baptisms, when Dillon baptizes a person, or especially babies, I assume you do it to everybody, you do the sign of the cross on the head and oil, right? Just the little sign. So early Christians would trace a small cross on their foreheads, and that's a reference to like Ezekiel chapter 9, a bunch of things in Revelation, and I have these listed here, but we're already over an hour, so I'm not going to open up my Bible and read those, but if you're interested, Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 7, Revelation chapter 7, verse 3, chapter 9, verse 4, and chapter 14, verse 1. So the mark was the cross, and the Greek letter tau. I'm saying that right? T-A-U. So the Greek letter tau, well, it's just a letter, but the way that we transliterate it into English is T-A-U. And this was written as kind of like the capital letter T, and it stood for the name of God. So by the 3rd century, Jesus followers were also tracing the small sign on their lips, on their breasts, and in the air as a blessing over people and things, as many Christians still do today, right? So if you bless a house, right? Dillon has done house blessings, especially in the new year, and you'll see like the sign of the cross, oftentimes with palm leaves and water. Again, you're seeing the palm leaves and the water and baptism water, all these earthly symbols incorporated over and over again. So,
and the sign of the cross in Lutheran churches, whether the faithful, meaning those who come and gather for worship, it's up to the individual whether or not they want to incorporate the sign of the cross. Some people do every week, some people don't. It's all, but the pastor in particular is encouraged. Most do, some don't, but most do. I'm doing the sign of the cross all the time in multiple parts of the service, every single week.
If you go to a church with a bulletin and you see a little cross in there, that is an invitation to do the sign of the cross. Yeah. So here's where I think it gets really interesting. So the larger sign of the cross that extends from our foreheads to our chest and then to our left and then to our right shoulder, that wasn't practiced until later. And it may have to do with the, oh my gosh, I'm going to say this word wrong. Monophysite?
The monophysites.
Am I saying that?
Yeah, monophysites.
Physicites? Are you sure?
Yeah, that's how I say it.
Okay. Well, there's this, we might be saying this wrong, but monophysites heresy in the 7th and 8th centuries. So these people were members of a 5th century Christian theological movement in the Eastern Roman Empire. And they believed in the Eastern Roman Empire that Christ was only divine in nature, not also human. Right, only divine in nature,
and that's still taught today in in the Monophysite Church.
And this belief was in direct contrast to an official Christian doctrine. And when I say official, I mean like bureaucratic kind of Christian doctrine formulated by the Chalcedonian Creed. Chalcedonian Creed. Thank you. I think I've said this in many episodes, but I read about this stuff and Dillon talks about this stuff, so I mispronounce a lot.
Well, but people say, is it roof or roof? You know,
roof. It is for sure.
Okay.
So the Chalcedonian Creed by the Council of Chalcedon, in 451, in the year 451, which states that Jesus the Christ has two natures, divine and human. So in the West, in the East, they believed Jesus was only divine. In the West, they believed Jesus was both divine and human. So if you're listening to this, you are part of the legacy that believes that Jesus was both divine and human. So I've been conditioned by this form of Christianity. So there's for sure bias here. I don't understand how we wouldn't think that Jesus is human because he was a person.
Well, there was some part of, they do believe that Jesus was human, but they don't believe in the two natures of fully human and fully divine. They believe that he was fully divine and partially human. There's not a. So when I teach confirmation students, I teach them what the church doctrine is in the Western Church, which includes Lutheranism, which is Jesus is not 100%. Jesus is 200%. 100% fully human, 100% fully divine. He holds both natures in its fullness.
Yeah, we said this in another episode, but you can't. So whenever I was getting my doctorate in language and culture, we talked a lot about identity, because language, you can't talk about language without talking about identity, right? So, because language shapes who we are, and who we are shapes our language. So, oh no, I'm losing it. Hold on. Oh, identity isn't a pie. So like I think about myself, I'm a professor, I'm a writer, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, right? Like I could take all these labels, which we love to do in the West. I'm not 25% a mother. I'm 100% mother. All the time. I'm all the time. Whenever I am on campus teaching students, I'm still a mother, right? Whenever I'm at home with my children, I'm still an educator. I'm still a professor. I'm always a writer, even when I'm not writing, right? Identity doesn't work. Identity is not math, right? So in the West, we believe Jesus was 100% divine and 100%. And we should talk about kenosis, maybe next episode.
Yeah, next episode.
Yeah, not right now. Next episode. I'm going to write it down quick though. Okay, let me write it down. Okay, so this debate, this is the most interesting part about the sign of the cross to me. So this debate between the East and the West, this conflict between Eastern and Western branches, those who believed in the single nature of Christ, divine only, in the East, they would make a large sign of the cross with only their index finger. So like hold up your index finger right now, like you're doing number 1, right? And make the sign of the cross. That's how they would do it. And that was so that it was visible to others that they believed in the single nature of Christ. And those who believed in the dual nature of Christ in the West, so both divine and human, would make the large sign of the cross with 2 fingers. So now make the sign of the cross with 2 fingers, right? So there was this like symbolic conflict occurring. And I think that's so funny and interesting. And this symbolized, the 1 finger symbolized single nature, and the two fingers symbolize the dual nature. Did I explain that pretty clearly?
Yeah, you did.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, this is so interesting because these are where some of these technicalities. I serve with a colleague. There's a colleague, a Lutheran pastor, a friend of mine, a colleague, and I know for a fact that when he makes the sign of the cross, he follows that old. So when I make the sign of the cross, I use the full hand.
I use like a sloppy hand.
Extend it. Whether I'm making the sign of the cross across my own body, or I'm making the sign of the cross over a blessing of the congregation, I use the full extension of my hand. And I know that one of my colleagues, he always makes the full form with the two fingers. It almost looks like a bunny rabbit with 2 ears and kind of coming together. If you were to have it on a shadow, it looks like a bunny rabbit ears. But he always crosses that, and I've asked him why, and I said, do you do this because of this old ancient heresy? He says, yes, of course I do. And I think that's I think it's beautiful. Actually, I don't do that.
But people were very emotionally tied to their way of seeing things, and that's not unlike today, right? People have very strong views about us included. I'm not rising above it. Me too, right? So they were having this kind of silent dispute over this theological concept of Jesus's identity. And the way in which you did the sign of the cross with 1 finger or 2 was a symbol that showed people which side of the argument you were on, because it mattered to people. So eventually this became known as a heresy. Jesus is just divine, and Christianity has come to adopt the dual nature of Christ as we have inherited it in the West.
I'm not really, I just want to, I probably don't need to, but I'm going to go on the record. There's not many hills I'll die on these days especially, but I think that might be a hill I'd die on. Jesus' 2 natures, even though it's a mystery and hard to, that makes sense to me. Exactly in what you had said. I'm 100% father. I'm 100% husband. I'm 100% pastor. I'm all these things. I'm not. Sometimes it might feel like I'm half this or I'm half that.
we're all of these things and we're none of these things.
Yeah, so absolutely. But
yeah. Identity is not math. Okay. So that's really all we have. We can wrap up. Our conclusions usually are not in 30 seconds. It's going to take a couple more minutes. But anything else to say about the sign of the cross?
I just want to say that when it comes to Protestants, if you are a Protestant and you're listening to this this podcast and you're thinking about whether or not maybe you would like to incorporate this very, very ancient, unifying, embodied practice of making the sign of the cross, the sign of the cross for Protestants is not a Roman Catholic practice.
Right, it doesn't belong to Catholics.
It does not belong to the Roman Catholic Church.
It is a beautiful thing they do.
It does not belong to the Eastern Orthodox Church. It belongs to the greater umbrella of Christianity. It's a deeply rooted Christian tradition. And so if you're Protestant, and you go to a church that welcomes that practice, that encourages that practice, and it's something that you would like to do, try it. It can be very embodying, especially connecting you to not only God, but your baptism, and connecting you in a way of living the reality of the triune God. And so it can be very helpful. And it's interesting that in the Reformation, people like Martin Luther and many of the other Lutheran reformers and reformers like Thomas Cranmer and the Church of England and other ones, they never abandoned this practice. Mm-hmm. It is in our Lutheran writings, in the Lutheran Small Catechism, making the sign of the cross. What happened was in the United States from its founding has a history of being anti-Catholic. Most people were Protestant, and so there was a very, very deep anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. One could argue still is today. So anything that looked Catholic, you would not want to participate in. So many of the Protestants, like the Episcopalians and the Lutherans, they stopped doing it because they didn't want to be looked at as something different. Mm-hmm. And yet it was very, very much, and still is very, very much, a part of their practice. So it's a deeply ancient, beautiful practice that's for all Christians.
Yeah. So
try it.
I tell Dillon all the time that Christianity to me feels like a big old book club. And I'm here for the story, right? So we gather around the story. We talk about what parts of the story move us. We debate it. I'm part of a book club. We meet once a month and we show up and we bring food and we talk about parts that we like and don't like and which parts work for us or move us, right? And that's what Christianity feels like to me, right? We gather around meals and we have a community and we regularly gather and we debate this story. I'm a big reader, so I'm here for it. And the deeper into this story I go, it somehow makes me feel more connected to others and to the mystery and to the earth and just to life in general. So learning about the cross and the sign of the cross and Trinity brings me deeper into it. Doing the sign of the cross is kind of just a way to symbolize this identity and who we are in some ways and a way to connect us to all of this. So, full disclosure, I do want to say this in conclusion, just for my own integrity. I have this bracelet. Dillon and I both have the same bracelets made from an olive tree in Israel, right?
Yep.
And it's these wooden beads, and it has a tiny little cross on it. A tiny cross. There are times when I'm out in public that I will pull my sleeve over it because I don't want people to see that I'm wearing a cross, because I don't want to be associated with some versions of Christianity. Like when I go to the bookstore and I go to the religion section, oh my goodness, the shame and embarrassment that I can feel because I know some of the damage that religion and Christianity has done and continues to do. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but it's true, so I'm sharing it. So if you have a cross necklace or any of that, that's great, but that is great. I said that with a lot more sarcasm than I intended, but that is great. It can be a beautiful thing, but just remember that it's very much making the sign of the cross, owning this history, wearing our crosses, having artwork in our homes with crosses, having crosses hanging around. That's a very important part of the story, and it's a very visceral part of the story, and it's a part of the story that should entice us to be very committed to being aligned against harmful systems. harmful systems that continue today to kill people. So I do just want to leave everybody with this one question. Did you want to say something first?
Well, I just want to say that the externals, that the things that are external, like the cross necklaces and the cross bracelets and other types of things, making the sign of the cross. We went to lunch after church this past Sunday, and I saw from afar two people. It looked like a husband and wife. I'm not really sure what it was. Before they ate, they said a short prayer. They both made the sign of the cross. It was in a public restaurant, and they were making a public profession of their faith. I think that's a beautiful and wonderful thing, and yet at the same time, knowing that sometimes that there's been parts and movements over time of the faith that have really, really destroyed people, we need to be cognizant of that and keep in mind.
Right.
And yet that should not keep us from praying in public or making the sign of the cross in public or wearing jewelry or other types of symbols. That would be like telling a Jewish person, maybe you shouldn't wear your yarmulke.
Yeah.
Maybe you should just wear that to the synagogue and leave that at home. Don't wear that to the restaurant. Or maybe for someone that is of the Muslim tradition, please don't wear your head coverings. Please don't. No, these are expressions of people's external parts of their faith, to which we should always be cognizant of what that might represent, and at the same time not have to there's a danger to only having a private faith.
Yes, and it's about the posture in which you do it. Are you wearing your crosses out in public or doing the sign of the cross or praying in public because you think that you're better than people? Or are you doing it because it's genuinely something?
Correct. And
right.
You have to balance that. One of the interesting things, I know you have something, but can I say this? One of the interesting things after World War II, when the Nazis destroyed many of the Jewish communities throughout Europe and implemented the most heinous thing, the Holocaust. After that, the United Nations gathered together and they came up with the Universal Doctrine on Human Rights. And one of the Universal Doctrine on Human Rights states that people have a right to their own religion, and they have a right to change their religion, and they have a right to have that religion and practice that religion in both private and public. That matters.
Yeah.
That matters. And yet being mindful of how those symbols throughout history have been watered down and could have been used to persecute people.
Yes.
The
Bible has been used to enslave people.
Yes.
It has been used to justify murdering people. I'm just trying to not feel shame about my shame of having a Christian identity and trying to normalize it for other people, because I know I'm not the only one who sometimes is like, oh yeah, I like wearing my necklace, but I won't wear it in certain places or around certain people.
Oh, absolutely.
So I do want to leave with just this question. If we find meaning in the Christian story and the story of Jesus' state-sanctioned murder on the cross, can we, as Christians, support the death penalty? So I could share statistics about how many men of color are put to death in this racist system that lifts up the death penalty. I could share statistics about how many people have been put to death in our country and then later found innocent. But another avenue to go is, if the Christian story is something that transforms you, we really need to think about the fact that the cross for Jesus is the same thing as the electric chair or lethal injection today for many people. And this is not an argument about innocence or guilt. That's not even what I'm saying. Because here's the thing, like I said earlier, Jesus was killed for being treacherous against the Roman Empire, and he is in fact guilty of treason. And those with power killed him for it. So should we take the form of the Roman Empire? Should our systems take the form of the Roman Empire and kill people for their guilt? Or should we take the form of Jesus? There's a difference. Obviously, for my very leading question, you know where I stand. But I think that it's important. It's a question to wrestle with.
I am very proud of being a Lutheran pastor, and the Lutheran Church, the ELCA, takes a public stance against the death penalty. And as a Lutheran pastor, I am free to have some of my own private beliefs, but I am very proud and stand publicly with the Lutheran Church, the ELCA, that opposes state-sanctioned death, that opposes the death penalty. And I think that the life of Jesus is, yes, about Jesus' death, which has brought something transformative, and yet the Christian life is about renewal and resurrection. And so as we make the sign of the cross in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that points us back to our baptism. It points us to a life of following the life and teachings of Jesus. That points us to life, not only death. And so this idea of being opposing the death penalty and bringing a restorative justice and understanding to people who even have done wrongs in the world, something that is restorative, a life that is restorative, is the life of Jesus. And that includes making the sign of the cross and incorporating that in your life.
Yeah, and if you are interested in any of these things that we talked about today, there's a book that I read last year. It's one of the best books I've ever written. It's called After Jesus. Did I say it's one of the best books I've ever written? It's one of the best books I've ever read. It's called After Jesus, Before Christianity, a historical exploration of the first 2 centuries of Jesus movements. And it's by a couple of authors from the West Star Christianity Seminar, and they write it in a way that is so readable. Like even if you
It's an excellent book.
Yeah, even if you have no comprehension of history and the Roman Empire, they really lay it all out there in a way that you could just pick it up and no matter where you are, understand what they're saying. And it's a very good read. And it's the same book that has the picture of the crucifixion foot with the nail going through it. It has a lot of pictures actually all throughout it. Very good. So if you're interested. All right. So be sure to listen next week. New episodes come out each Sunday, and you can follow us on Instagram at church_chatter_podcast. Also, we had somebody who made us a little jingle. I don't know if she wants us to share her name or not. I'm going to try to put it on this episode. I need to figure out the technology about how to do that. So you might hear a song before and after our episode now. If not now, soon. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for that wonderful jingle, and it is lovely, and we love it, and we're glad that it can now be a part of our weekly podcast.
Yeah, have a good week.
To